Cool. So what we're going to get into now here is, let me bring up my outline here. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this from other programs. And the first one we're going to look at here is Illustrator. And the general idea of this is, if you're familiar with Illustrator, similar to how we created it inside of Cinema 4D, you would use the pen tool inside of Illustrator in order to create your shapes. That's actually the way that I created these shapes to begin with. After I drew it on a digital program, I went into Illustrator and I traced them that way. So if I just open up Illustrator real fast and turn on Splines so that you can see them, you can see that here I have my shapes that I've created using, I think I might have live traced these in order to get them in here, but however you want to do it, if you're comfortable using the pen tool inside of Illustrator, you can create your shapes this way, which is the same similar process in terms of using a Bezier. Some people are more comfortable doing spline points inside of Illustrator more than they are in Cinema 4D, so if you didn't like doing them inside of Cinema 4D when we were just doing them, and you want to do them inside of Illustrator, that's totally cool. Now the only trick, and this has actually been remedied in the latest version of Cinema 4D that just came out a week ago or so, maybe even less. If anyone's paying attention to the Cinema 4D news, they came out with a new version of Cinema 4D, R25, which kind of rectifies what I'm going to show you right now, but since we're still on the older version, I'm going to show you this way anyway. So if you're creating this, if you're using text inside of Illustrator, there's one extra step that you need to do, because text inside of Illustrator isn't a shape path by default. So, this default text that I have here, and I'll make it impact just so that it's a different font or whatever. So this text that's here, if I were to make this COMD, by default, this doesn't actually have any shapes to it, because that's not how text works inside of Illustrator. You actually would have to go up to Object, Expand, and then click OK. And now this is actually spline paths that you can actually import into Cinema 4D. You just can't bring text by default inside of Cinema 4D. Of course, you can just create text inside of Cinema 4D. So if you're just doing this for text, it may not even make sense to do it in Illustrator first, unless you already have a pre-existing design that you did in Illustrator and you're trying to bring that into Cinema 4D, which is totally cool. If that's what you want to go for, that totally works. But the main idea of bringing Illustrator into Cinema 4D is you just have to save it as Illustrator 8 or older, but 8 is the one that you usually go for. All these other formats, for whatever reason, Cinema 4D, until the latest version that just came out, didn't accept it. So once you export this out of Illustrator as Illustrator 8, so File, Save As, choose a location. I'm just going to put the number 8 on this just so I know. Hit Save, and then in this drop down, there's a whole bunch of different versions, and the one that we're going to choose is 8. And then it's going to tell you that it's going to save as the old format, which is okay. And then this file will be in here. And then once you have this inside of your folder, what you can do is you can actually drag this directly into Cinema 4D's viewport. So if I make a new scene just to make it everything from clean, I can select this in my Explorer, and this works on Mac or PC, or I guess even Linux if you have that, and drag this into your viewport, and you should get this Adobe Illustrator dialog window. So this right here will allow you to import your file inside of Cinema 4D. Now there are some options here that you can adjust, like connect splines, which, like it sounds, it says it connects the splines together, or group splines if you uncheck this, or you could uncheck group splines. Now depending on how you created your logo in Illustrator, one of these methods might be better than the other. For now, I'm just going to click OK and see if this works or not. Okay, it sort of brought in my splines, so you can see here that it brought in my splines that I had already created, and it looks like it has some extra stuff that I don't need. So I might delete some of these extra paths that I have in here, and right off the bat here, I could make an extrude object in my scene, and let's see if we drag this below it, will it work? So no, it couldn't read this, but if you remember from before, I suggested that the first step, if you don't see anything showing up in your viewport, is to turn on hierarchical in the object properties and object attributes. So if I click this and I zoom out, because for whatever reason it made my text really, really long, now you can see that my text here is already built together. And as some of you was asking before, you know, in this case, I have separate text objects, which means that I can actually move and adjust these after the fact, which might be handy if I'm trying to do something, you know, more unique, or maybe I don't like the original design that I had in Illustrator or whatever, you know, program that I originally created it in. So just like that, without having to do all the work of tracing our letters, I already have it built. So, you know, this method might be quicker for some of you who are very proficient with Adobe Illustrator. You know, I'll leave it to you to decide which way works better for you in your particular workflow. But I definitely want you to be aware of this, because this is something that, you know, you might do a lot of depending on, you know, what work you do inside of Cinema 4D. A lot of the work that I do has been building like 3D logos inside of Cinema 4D for different uses, either for animation or just for design purposes. So using this sort of technique, you could bring in, you know, a 3D Illustrator vector logo of your choice and rebuild it in 3D, and, you know, show it to a client, upcharge them, and then, you know, get all the monies for it, maybe, or maybe not. It kind of depends. But that's one way that you can sort of build your logo from Illustrator. Now, again, if anyone has any questions while I'm going through this, please feel free to ask. I'm sure not everyone has Illustrator installed on the computer, but, you know, it might be handy for this case if you do choose to use it. So that's the Illustrator 8 method. The Photoshop method is very similar. You would create the paths inside of Photoshop, and then you would have to export it out of Photoshop as a similar process. It still has to be an older version of an EPS or an AI file. So, you know, same rules apply in terms of making it an older version of Illustrator in order for Cinema 4D to accept it. And again, this has been remedied and... No, go for it. There is. GIMP is one version that I can think of off the top. That's a free version of Photoshop. Okay, yeah, so GIMP is one. I know some people like using Affinity Designer. If anyone's heard of that one, it's still costs, but it's a lot cheaper than Photoshop. It's like $50 or something, and you can use it forever. And it's Illustrator and Photoshop in one. So yeah, there definitely are alternatives. So don't feel like you have to use Photoshop. You know, that's just one of the industry standards. But if you want to use GIMP, that's totally cool. If you want to use, I don't know, some of you might use Procreate or some other design programs like that. I'm not sure if those have ability to export out splines in them, but if any of those programs do have that ability, then that might actually work inside of Cinema 4D as well. So, you know, however you want to create your lettering is totally cool with me, as long as you can eventually bring it into 3D, bring it into Cinema 4D and translate it into a 3D way. So, you know, I saw that a lot of you have submitted your assignments already, and they look pretty cool in terms of what you have going for them. So there's definitely a bunch of different ways you can go about doing those designs inside of Cinema 4D. So yeah, no, if anyone has any questions with that, or if you want to use something that I haven't mentioned here, and you're curious about it, you know, just let me know, and I can hopefully help you out with that. So yeah, so that's the way that you can bring it in from Illustrator. Just to show you real quick, if I were to bring this in, say, let's say I don't connect the splines and I don't group everything together. Let's see, does it change anything? So let's see. So it definitely gives me a lot different more items, and you can see here that when I brought it in without having it group things together and connect things, it actually gave things as separate objects. So let's see, if I were to extrude, and I'm going to do the shortcut for this now, which is if I hold the Alt key on the keyboard and then hit the extrude object, it automatically puts all of my objects as a child of the extrude object. So it's a little shortcut for speeding up that workflow. And then if I turn on hierarchical, let's see if does this work. Oh, so see here, because it didn't connect things together, it didn't actually build my text as I originally had thought it would. So the O and the D inserts in the middle and this outer box are all kind of not what I want. Now I probably could, you know, come in here really fast and maybe, let's say if I delete my outer splines, and one thing that you could do really fast if you don't want to, you know, deal with this is you can also middle mouse click on your top object in your hierarchy, and this will actually select everything automatically below it. Of course I could have just done this by dragging as well, but middle mouse click works for what I have in mind here. And I could right click, go all the way down to connect objects and delete, and just connect everything together. And just like this, now it's all one piece. Now the only problem with this is, of course, if I wanted to move the D or the O or the C or the M independently of each other, now I'm kind of stuck, and I would have to go into point mode, as someone asked earlier, and sort of move these elements on their own, you know, either as a group or individually. So this way might not be the best way if that's what you want to do later on, but just to show you that there is a quicker way to connect everything together. So a bunch of different ways here, and I'm sure as you make your text, you'll either find ways that work for you or ways that make sense to how you think about using 3D. I mean, a lot of this is sort of figuring out the workflow that works best for you, especially if you're working more on your own sort of like individual projects. If you're working more in a group setting, then, you know, sometimes it helps to have some sort of cohesive workflow between other people, just so that, you know, other people aren't lost when they're looking at your projects. But for this one, you can totally, you know, decide on your own which method works best for you in terms of creating your text. Yeah, and using whatever program you want to use. As long as the program that you choose to use, if you use sort of this method of, you know, importing it from an external program, as long as it has the ability to create paths and to save out a vector format, EPS also works as well, then you can totally bring that into Cinema 4D. And newer version of Cinema 4D, you don't even have to worry about this. So that's sort of the method for importing splines inside of Cinema 4D from external programs. Again, if anyone has any questions with that, just let me know.